What if the moments you've been interpreting as delays were never delays in the way you assumed, but part of a sequence that only reveals its logic after you've already moved through it? Because most people expect change to arrive clearly, to feel like an opportunity they can recognize immediately, something that confirms itself before they step into it. But in practice, that's almost never how it happens. More often, it begins in a way that feels inconvenient, sometimes even disruptive, as if something that used to hold your life in place has started to loosen without asking for your permission. At first, it doesn't seem significant. Nothing has fully collapsed, nothing has clearly ended, but there is a subtle shift in how things respond. What once felt stable begins to feel slightly uncertain. Plans that used to move forward without much resistance begin to stall or redirect. Situations that once made sense no longer feel as complete as they did before. And it's in that early stage that most people assume something is going wrong, because they are measuring the situation against a previous sense of order that is no longer intact. The natural reaction is to try to correct it, to restore things to how they were, to bring back the clarity that seems to be slipping away. But what if that instinct is based on a misunderstanding? What if the reason things are no longer responding the same way is not because they are failing, but because they are no longer meant to function in the way they once did? Because when a structure begins to outlive its relevance to you, it doesn't always disappear immediately. It begins by losing its ability to fully support you, and that loss of support is often experienced as confusion. In that confusion, something else quietly begins to take place, something that is easy to miss if you are only focused on what is no longer working. Small openings start to appear, but they rarely look like opportunities in the conventional sense. They show up indirectly, often disguised as interruptions or unexpected shifts. A conversation that alters how you see something, even if only slightly. An idea that continues to return to your attention, even after you try to dismiss it. A situation that places you somewhere unfamiliar, without any clear indication of why you're there. Individually, these moments don't seem important. They don't carry the weight of certainty, and they don't announce themselves as turning points. But if you remain attentive, you begin to notice that they are not entirely random. There is a subtle consistency to them, a direction that begins to form beneath the surface. And this is where the experience starts to change, because what once felt like scattered, disconnected events begins to reveal itself as something more coherent. Most people overlook this stage because it doesn't match their expectations. They are waiting for something obvious, something that confirms itself immediately. And because of that, they miss the quieter signals that are already guiding them. But once you begin to recognize that these subtle shifts are not accidental, your attention changes. You start to observe more closely. You begin to connect moments that you would have previously ignored. And slowly, a pattern starts to emerge. Not a loud or dramatic one, but a precise one. As that pattern becomes more visible, something else begins to shift. Not necessarily in the external situation right away, but in how you respond to it. You may not have a fully formed plan, and you may not be able to explain where things are leading, but there is a growing sense that remaining in the same position is no longer an option. So you begin to move, not in a dramatic or impulsive way, but through small decisions that gradually change your direction. You follow a thought a little further than you normally would. You engage with something you might have dismissed before. You allow yourself to explore without needing immediate certainty. And as you begin to move in this way, something that once felt constant starts to shift. the resistance that used to define your experience begins to change its character. It doesn't disappear, but it no longer feels like something you are pushing against endlessly. Situations that once required significant effort begin to respond with less force. Conversations that used to feel blocked begin to open more naturally. Progress, even if it is still gradual, begins to feel less strained. It's important to understand that this does not mean everything suddenly becomes easy. The difference is not the absence of difficulty, but the change in its nature. Instead of feeling like you are forcing something to work within a structure that doesn't support you, it begins to feel like you are moving within something that is already in motion. The friction that once came from misalignment starts to ease, not because obstacles vanish, but because you are no longer operating in a direction that contradicts your own movement. As this shift continues, another layer begins to unfold, one that is more internal than external. Your relationship with uncertainty starts to change. At the beginning of this process, uncertainty feels like something that needs to be resolved as quickly as possible. It creates pressure, because without a clear outcome, it is difficult to feel grounded in your decisions. But over time, as you continue to move and observe the way things respond, something begins to adjust in how you interpret that uncertainty. It no longer feels like an immediate problem. It begins to feel like a space you can exist within, even without having all the answers. You start to notice that clarity does not come before action, but through it. That the next step does not reveal itself all at once, but becomes visible as a result of movement. And once you see that pattern clearly enough times, your dependence on having everything figured out in advance begins to weaken. This is where something deeper forms, not as a concept, but as a result of experience. You begin to recognize that the absence of certainty does not mean the absence of direction. That what feels incomplete is not necessarily incorrect, but simply in the process of unfolding. And that recognition changes the way you approach each moment, because instead of trying to eliminate uncertainty, you begin to move with it. As that happens, your perspective starts to shift in a more noticeable way. Situations that once felt like setbacks begin to look different. What you initially interpreted as something being taken away starts to reveal itself as space being created. What felt like failure begins to look more like redirection. And this is not a forced way of thinking, not an attempt to stay positive, but a natural result of seeing how each phase connects to the next. You begin to understand that what appeared to be random disruptions were actually part of a sequence, one that could not have unfolded in the same way if everything had remained stable. Because stability, while comfortable, can also limit movement. And when movement becomes necessary, that stability has to shift, even if it feels inconvenient at the time. Over time, this leads to a change that is less about what is happening around you and more about how you experience it. The external path may still be forming. The outcome may still be unclear, but internally, something begins to settle. There is a kind of quiet stability that develops, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer trying to resolve everything immediately. You become more comfortable existing within a process that is still unfolding, because you have seen enough to recognize that it is not random. You begin to trust the movement, not blindly, but because you have observed its consistency. And that trust does not remove uncertainty, but it changes how you relate to it. From that point forward, the way you interpret change is no longer the same. You stop seeing these moments as isolated events and begin to recognize them as transitions. What once felt like closed paths begin to look like shifts from one phase into another. what seemed like endings begin to reveal themselves as points of movement between different structures of your life. And once that becomes clear, something else naturally follows. You stop trying to return to what was simply because it was familiar. You stop measuring everything against a previous version of stability that no longer applies. Instead, you begin to move with what is unfolding, even if you cannot yet see the full shape of it, because at that point, you understand something that is difficult to see when you are in the middle of the process, which is that the path was never actually disappearing. It was adjusting. It was reorganizing itself in response to changes that were happening within you, changes that required a different structure to support them. And when you look back, what once felt like delay no longer appears that way. It begins to make sense as part of a sequence, one where each phase created the conditions for the next. The disruptions, the uncertainty, the subtle openings, the gradual movement, the shift in perspective, all of it forming a progression that could not have been understood from the beginning. So the question is no longer why things didn't happen when you expected them to, or why certain paths didn't hold the way you thought they would. The question becomes whether you are willing to recognize what is already unfolding, even if it does not match the shape you originally imagined, because the process does not require perfect understanding to continue. It only requires that you remain attentive enough to notice where things are shifting, and responsive enough to move when they do. And when you do that, what once felt uncertain begins to feel structured in a different way. Not because it becomes predictable, but because you begin to see the coherence within it. And that coherence changes everything, because it allows you to move forward without needing to force clarity where it has not yet fully formed. It allows you to recognize that what you once called delay was never about time being lost, but about alignment taking place in a way that could not be rushed. And once you see that clearly, you stop waiting for the path to appear all at once, and start recognizing that it has been forming with every shift, every disruption, every moment that seemed out of place at the time. Not randomly, not against you, but in response to something that has been changing within you all along.